I knew the exact moment the company was doomed. It wasn't the stock wobble on a Tuesday, or the email from investor relations that read like a eulogy. It was when Jared walked into the all-hands and smiled like he'd invented the internet. He had that new CTO swagger, blazer with no tie, sleeves rolled up as if sleeves alone could debug organizational rot, voice tuned to maximum disruption. The room quieted because execs will always quiet for a performer. I watched him from the back, nursing a cold coffee that had long surrendered to loneliness, and felt the same tired private fury I get when someone calls my work legacy garbage, like they're naming a disease no one should care to cure. Quantum Ops was not garbage. Quantum Ops was the thing that kept pallets moving across 3 continents during the 2020 logistics meltdown. Quantum Ops was the engine that turned a startup's frantic scramble into steady pulses of API calls, predictable inventory states, and payroll that landed where it needed to land. I had written most of it between flights, on whiteboards scavenged from other teams, and on an ergonomic keyboard purchased by my own savings, because the company could never be bothered to buy engineering decent chairs. I had been on call when the servers choked at 3 a.m., patching from the glow of a truck stop diner, and thinking, more than once, that some people should pay more attention to what kept their business breathing. I didn't build it as an employee project because I didn't want it to be swallowed whole. I incorporated Ironclad Logic LLC the year we finally proved we could predict supply chain fluctuations well enough to sell to enterprise. The license agreement wasn't paranoia, it was a business instrument. I structured the contract so the company had a perpetual license subject to quarterly payments and defined maintenance windows. There were grace periods. There were termination clauses. Paragraph 4 spelled out revocation on material breach. Paragraph 6 covered remedies and assignment rights. It was not Shakespeare. It was a tool. The point was simple. The code was mine unless they'd buy it outright. That arrangement kept me fed, and more to the point, gave me leverage the day the office stopped pretending they needed me. Legacy garbage, Jared said, waving his hands as if conjuring up a more modern future. We have to rip out the ossified core. This tech is all knots and duct tape. It's slowing us down. We're going forward, not backward. He said it like a sermon. Tyler, the product evangelist, applauded before anyone else, as if applause was the part of change management he was good at. Brenda from HR looked like someone who had swallowed a lemon and kept it there. Richard, our CEO, who'd done an excellent job all these years at looking rich and occasionally decisive, shifted in his seat and asked the kind of questions that sound like curiosity, but are actually fishing for optics. How long do you think the migration will take? Can we run both systems for a quarter? Jared's answer was beautifully malicious. We can sunset it fast. It sends the right signal. The market hates legacy. Plus, we'll be able to rebrand any of the wins. He smiled at the cameras. He loved cameras the way a recruit loves recruitment. I sat in the back and felt my identity compress into a word. Invisible. All the small repairs, the obscure refactors that saved millions in SaaS fees, the one-off APIs to vendors who refused to integrate unless we promised to be the format they wanted, those were background magic. No one takes a picture of background magic, but the business relied on it. And that's a funny thing about systems. They demand service until you flip the light switch and realize the wiring was never inspected. After the meeting, my calendar began to evaporate like someone unlabeled opening a packet of time. Weekly check-ins disappeared. You are no longer needed on the migration roadmap, read an impersonal Slack DM from Tyler that tried too hard to be gentle. Access to staging began to fail. A new admin account had been provisioned for platform ownership, and the email address that controlled the license server was an address I didn't recognize. Small bureaucratic coups are the worst kind because they are surgical. No drama, just reassignment. But bureaucracy makes noise when something big is happening. I listened to its silence like a radio trying to tune into a faint station. Mike, a junior engineer who still believed code had a moral arc, pinged me with a screenshot, a calendar invite marked Owner, Tyler. He added, "Did you okay this? Jared's moving fast." I hadn't. I read the calendar invite twice. Then I went to the billing dashboard because the license payments were routed through Ironclad. The dashboard is a small, stubborn thing I check out of habit. There it was. The quarterly invoice for Quantum Ops had not been paid. Not overdue by a week or a day. The status read, "Payment failed," and the due date had quietly slid into the past. It felt like watching a patient flatline on a monitor and realizing someone had muted the alarms. It wasn't a mistake. The company had been avoiding the invoices. Maybe they assumed they could force a migration mid-quarter and nullify the obligation. Maybe they thought owning headcount was the same as owning product. Maybe they just liked the feeling of pushing important things off the table. Whatever their reasoning, the contract treatment was clear. Missed payment is a material breach if it remains unpaid after notice. Paragraph 4, paragraph 6. Legalese that had saved me from worse than condescension now gleamed with the kind of lethal plainness lawyers prefer: remedies upon breach and the right to revoke usage. I laughed then. It came out as a sound both ridiculous and bright, because the universe has a sense of humor, and corporate negligence is especially good at being dramatic when you already have a plan. If they wanted to treat the license like a forgivable charity, I had options. Not because I wanted to be cruel. The truth is I'm tired of being invisible, but because the contract said what the contract said. Contracts are permissions. They can be revoked. They can be enforced. There is a moral grayness to that kind of enforcement. People always want clear-cut villains. I can't give that to them. Jared was arrogant and spectacularly oblivious. He took credit and had charm in the way that makes people hand over seatbelts and trust. But he was also a symptom of a leadership culture that undervalued operational expertise until it was loud enough to be irrefutable. My actions would be procedural and papered, not pious. They were business. They were, in a narrow legal sense, the enforcement of an agreement. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the private arithmetic of it. The license defined a grace node where the system would keep running for a short period after a mispayment. Call it professional courtesy. But if the owner toggled enforcement, usage would be limited to read-only. Control plane features would suspend and vendor tokens would expire. Those words on the page mean something in practice. APIs stop accepting rights, inventory stops updating, purchase orders pile up like uncashed checks. It's administratia until it's not, until someone wakes on Monday to find orders on red and payroll in limbo. I knew how terrifying a Monday that would be. By Thursday, the freeze-out had a face. My badge wouldn't unlock the front door that afternoon. An email from Brenda asked me to stop by HR to discuss transition logistics. I walked into the glass-walled conference room feeling like a dog being shown the front door in slow motion. Everyone else had the luxury of moral panic, which is really just the performance of being surprised. Jared led the meeting. He had the script. We're moving in a new direction. Thank you for your years of service. We're going to part ways amicably. He said amicably the way a dentist says little pinch before extracting a molar. He had already written the LinkedIn post in his head, the one that would reframe the firing as strategic realignment and list his glossy list of leadership nouns. He wanted to clear a path and a narrative at once. I handed him my badge. It slid across the table like a surrendered weapon. He paused, triumphant, in the way triumphant men do when the act of triumph is the thing that makes their day feel whole. He spun the moment into an anecdote. We welcome fresh perspectives. We need to move faster.
We are grateful for Emily's contributions. He pronounced grateful like a benediction. It was theater. Then I did the thing that made Jared blink. I smiled, slow and precise, and reached into my bag for the copy of the license agreement I'd printed out the week before, because I find paper comforting. People laughed then, awkward chuckles, the ones that come when you break the rhythm of a script they expected. But I wasn't laughing. I laid the stack of pages in front of him and tapped paragraph 4. This is the vendor agreement between Quanta Logistics Inc. and Ironclad Logic LLC, I said. It describes the license, the payment terms, and the remedies available to me if payments aren't made. It also describes revocation rights. You could see Jared's face compute in stages: annoyance, dismissal, then a flash of confusion that should have been the end of the conversation for him. You're fired as an employee, Emily, he said. That doesn't change your status with the company. Correct, but wrong. Actually, I replied, it does. You're conflating two different legal relationships. The employment relationship and the vendor relationship run on separate rails. My license isn't extinguished by your feeling creative this quarter. If anything, shifting employees around doesn't negate an outstanding contractual obligation. He leaned in like he was going to lecture me about optics or pivot strategies, which is what senior technologists call their ego with a roadmap. Paragraph 4 is meaningless, he said. We're still running the system. You can't just... Read paragraph 4, I said, carefully. People who work in tech love lines. They love clean, declarative statements. Paragraph 4 had been written to be exactly that. Clear about breach, notice, and the mechanics of revocation. It had a toggled enforcement clause that was phrased in dry, almost polite English. In the event of material breach, licensor may, upon notice, exercise enforcement measures, including but not limited to restricting write access and suspending certain integrations, until cure or agreement on disposition. That phrasing kept lawyers happy and made business managers uncomfortable. Those commas are a kind of weapon if you happen to be the holder of rights. Jared looked at the pages, then at Brenda, who did not look equipped to arbitrate contracts. Richard shifted in his chair, trying on the vague posture of a CEO who had spent his career delegating uncomfortable things. For a moment, you could feel authority recalculating like a broken clock trying to find noon. You can't do that, Jared said finally. If you enforce the license, you'll bring down operations. That will hurt customers. That will hurt us. It's reckless. It will be contractual enforcement, I said. It will be an exercise of rights I've had in place for years. If you prefer, call it responsible asset management. I left the meeting with my badge and my papers and a small, cold joy that comes from a plan moving from thought to possibility. But the conversation had changed. Jared assumed he had bought himself a future built on a narrative of innovation and, in his mind, poor previous choices. In truth, he had bought, by neglect, an argument that the company was not a perpetual licensee in good standing. Someone in the building had decided to stop respect and run a migration as a fait accompli. They had chosen perception over payment. That night, I didn't sleep much. There's a particular kind of insomnia that engineers understand, the mind in maintenance mode. You watch the systems you love like a parent hovering over a sleeping child. Only now, the view is different. I could see the architecture in my head, the heartbeat pings to the license server, the vendor API keys exchanged once and brokered through an internal dispatcher, the idempotent hooks that made inventory consistent even when vendors lied. All of those things are boring on paper. They're miraculous in practice. I called Mike because he was the one likely to be caught in the immediate churn. He picked up after 2 rings, voice bright and a little terrified. He had been on a support rotation earlier and said the ticket queue had started to show weird errors. Inventory webhooks are failing silently, he said. No errors in the app, just nothing. Vendors are reporting late deliveries. Can you trace where the right requests are being rejected? I asked. I can see a 403 on certain endpoints on staging, he said, then added quickly. But I don't want to be the guy who pokes the dragon. Don't poke anything, I said. Document what you see. Timestamps, endpoints, vendor IDs, save logs. If things go sideways, we need facts. Transaction evidence of failed operations. Not because I enjoy litigation, but because paperwork is what turns panic into negotiation. He laughed, the sound fragile. You're calm, he said. I'm used to being the person who cleans up after the circus, I told him. Calm is a survival mechanism. Before hanging up, I sent a 1-line note to Heavy Metal Dave, my lawyer who lives between a pawn shop and a guitar store and has a PhD in no-nonsense. Dave's text back was typically succinct. Paragraph 4 reads like an instrument. You have rights. DM me the invoice history. We talked in clipped bursts all night. Dave reminded me not to touch anything that might look like tampering. Make sure any enforcement looks like enforcement, he warned. Paperwork, notices, logs. If you have to flip an administrative switch, do it through the channels the contract contemplates. No theatrics. He also said something softer, which is odd for Heavy Metal Dave. You built tangible value. Don't let them rewrite the story about who built what. Friday finished with small humiliations for them and precise preparation for me.
I sent a notice of breach per the contract, calm, by certified mail and email to the billing contact. It was the kind of message that reads like a clinical memo. Dates, invoices, overdue status, citation of paragraph 4, a statement of intent to exercise remedies if not cured within the contract's cure period. I CC'd Richard and Brenda, and because I'm petty in the smallest and most satisfying ways, I hit reply all to Tyler's previous message and included the invoice summary. That night, I packed a bag, not out of anticipation of anything dramatic, but because people who chase their work to the ends of their careers often travel light mentally. The bag had the obvious things: phone charger, an extra sweater, the same notepad with the same coffee stains. It also had the pages of the contract I had tapped in the meeting, dog-eared where I had underlined revocation. Saturday morning was quiet, calmer than it had any right to be, given the trap door I'd left propped open. I walked to a coffee shop that still used paper cups and thought about the first time Quantum Ops had gone live. I thought about how people had cheered when the first vendor integration confirmed a purchase order without human intervention. I thought about the nights on call that had bleached the edges of my life. There is a private accounting where you tally hours and trade-offs and personal sacrifices. That accounting doesn't pay rent, but it's a ledger you keep in your chest. I called my mother, because habit makes people do the predictable thing in times of stress. She asked about my day, and then, in that chapter of life where mothers are both proud and baffled, asked if I was okay. Are you going to be all right? She asked. Her voice was small on the phone. I will be, I lied. But it wasn't really a lie. I'm not always the traditional hero, but I'm durable in odd, useful ways. I have a contract, I have patience, I have a lawyer who actually listens to power chords on his lunch break. I have a system that, by virtue of its design and the contract layered over it, responds to administrative decisions. Sunday I spent in a strange state of anticipation that feels like being at the top of a ski lift. Everything is suspended, and you can still step off. I went over the options in my head. There is a line between ruthless and reasonable that good people step across for the right reasons. Enforcing a contract because you want to be vindictive is ugly. Enforcing a contract because the other party has treated core assets as fungible is stewardship. I told myself that a dozen times until it became true. On Sunday night, I did something small and deliberate. I opened the ironclad admin console from my home office, where the router didn't know my life had changed. There are configuration options I had set up when I expected more collaboration and less hubris. One of them is called, in the dry nomenclature of software, enforcement mode.
Under normal operations, it's set to grace to handle transient failures, card declines, bank hiccups, integration retries. But it is engineered to be switchable. There's always a switch. There is always someone who builds the tools, and later, someone else who assumes the tools will be benign forever. I stared at the toggle for a long time. That moment was oddly biblical for someone who doesn't do scripture much. The hush before judgment. Heavy Metal Dave's Lab's text popped up. If you flick that switch without following notice, it's ugly. If you follow notice, it's a contract. Your call. I printed one last copy of the notices, signed the receipt confirmations that would later prove delivery, and then closed my laptop. My hand hovered near the keyboard longer than it needed to. There is a special kind of responsibility that comes with power over systems other people depend on. You can be theatrical about it, or you can be precise. I slept poorly and woke to my phone buzzing with the wrong sort of urgency. It was Mike. Something's happening. Vendors reporting write failures. Can't post shipments. His messages came in like the beginning of a storm. Slowing in the system, a vendor API returning an unfamiliar status, a payroll batch stalling at 3 a.m. I breathed out, the way you do when things finally move from possibility to action. This was not fun in the way people imagine revenge to be. This was a test of a design I had invented and a contract I had insisted upon. It was whether the paper I had folded into my life had teeth. I had two choices in that moment. Execute the enforcement now, march into office with my own melodrama and watch Jared seize the moral high ground by screaming about consequences, or do the work quietly and let the consequences speak for themselves. I chose the latter. I sent a short email that mirrored the certified notice, clear, brief, and referencing the timer on the cure period. Then I confirmed with Heavy Metal Dave that he'd read the logs I had forwarded. He thumbed back a single emoji that for him means proceed. It was Friday morning when I hit the toggle. No fireworks, no big red button. Just administrative machinery clicking through its checks like a clock finally paid the bill. I did not flip it recklessly. I followed the notice, I followed the contract. I sent follow-ups to billing, copying Richard, and included the CFO because paper is louder than speeches. Then I went into the day and watched. At first there were whispers. Tyler sent a Slack with gifs and optimism. Jared posted a thread on how change is hard but necessary. The public version of events, if you watch the company channels, was calm, polished, controlled. The private version was slower and more frantic. I started getting texts at work numbers from people I barely knew. Why is our PO pipeline failing? Is anyone looking into the webhook errors? Payroll reports a partial failure. The cascade doesn't look cinematic when it starts. It looks like a lot of small, confused voices, but those small voices aggregate into panic fast. Teams tried the usual things: restart the dispatcher, reissue credentials, patch a config. None of it worked, because the system had been placed into a state that required a valid license handshake to accept write operations. The read path still functioned, dashboards still rendered yesterday's truths, but at the places that actually move things, order confirmations, shipments, vendor reconciliations, the knobs were stiff. At 10:04 a.m., Jared called me. I let it ring twice. He left a message that was mostly performative. Emily, this is Jared. We're seeing some issues with the system. Would like to understand what's going on. Call me. He sounded taut, which is always an entertaining emotion on people who believe performance equals control. I called back. Do you understand what you just did? He demanded. The first sentence was not a question once his mouth had shaped it. I enforced a contractual right, I said. You misplaced a payment. Paragraph 4 is what it is. This is sabotage, he said. This is purposeful. No, I replied. Sabotage is malicious, unlawful interference. This is the enforcement of a license. If you want to talk about intent, let's talk about why the invoice shows us payment failed without any attempt to cure. He tried the old leadership trick of turning facts into feelings. You're hurting customers. I'm forcing a business conversation that should have happened months ago, I said. If you want to restore service, you can cure the breach or negotiate a transfer. There it was, the shift from furor to bargaining. In the background, my inbox filled with terse messages from someone in legal asking for logs, and someone in ops asking for emergency patches. Tyler's optimism had curdled to a defensive tone. Mike sent an all-hands update that read like a man trying to both tell the truth and keep his job. Investigating write failures to several vendor endpoints, no ETA. How much? Jared asked without preamble. The question was blunt and transactional, and for that moment he abandoned performance and became a negotiator. I gave a number that was sane and anchored in paperwork. The cost of replacement engineering, lost revenue tied to stalled shipments, a calculation I'd run with a spreadsheet that didn't show how tired I was, but did show the math. $2.6 million.
It sounds like a lot because it is a lot. The number wasn't plucked from thin air. It was a documented valuation of lost margin and a ballpark for the work required to rebuild the same capabilities in a manner that would be supportable without the original architects. I'd seen teams spend more on consultants alone. You can't be serious, Jared said. I'm serious, I replied. Either cure the breach by paying the outstanding invoices and allowing us to enter into negotiations, or negotiate to buy the IP. Those are the contractual paths.
I am open to transfer of ownership or a corrected payment. Either way, the system is in the state the contract allows. He barked something about optics, stakeholders, and lawsuits. He wasn't bluffing, he was panicking. That panic sounded on the phone like a machine missing an essential part. He asked for an hour. He wanted to pull legal in and get back to me. I hung up and watched the room fill with the kind of calls and messages you see when a company realizes it has traded a muscle for an illusion. People began to text me directly, some pleading, some accusing, most stunned. Brenda sent a message that was half apology and half document. We were told to pause invoices pending migration. I'm so sorry, this slipped. Someone stopped the payments, I said when I replied. I need the accounting chain. Who authorized the pause? Silence can be a weapon. It can also be an admission. The silence that came back implied the former. By the time the hour was nearly up, Jared had convened a war room. It had all the usual props: a plasma display, a list of priorities, and a man who had to pretend he had not misread the infrastructure that supported his new title. I stayed out of their room for 2 reasons. 1, because being there felt performative on my part. 2, because whatever they did inside that echo chamber wouldn't change the contract. It would only change their willingness to engage on my terms. At 1:12 p.m., Richard called me. His voice sounded smaller on the phone than it had in the boardroom. He asked about customers, reputational damage, and whether I was willing to help them through this. There was a plea there that tasted faintly of relief. He wanted a path to a solution that would not be public and ugly. You want a fix, I said. You can either cure the breach by making good on the invoices and entering a negotiation for either continued license or purchase, or you can sit in outage. That will cost more than the number I'm asking. There was a pause that dragged like wet cloth. Then Richard said, how much to transfer everything now, cleanly? Not a negotiation, a transfer. I repeated the figure. $2.6 million for IP transfer and perpetual license with assignment of support for 90 days. Wire, we close, service restored. He inhaled a breath that sounded like a man counting the cost of his mistakes. I need proof that this money buys us something, he said. He wanted assurances. He wanted receipts that weren't just words. Understandable. I will restore service upon confirmation of funds and execution of an assignment agreement, I said. We'll use a simple transfer instrument. Heavy Metal Dave will draft it. But the mechanics are straightforward. Wire, sign, me authorize the transfer. After that, operations return to normal. He asked for a less dramatic path, begging me to come back as the head of platform and lead the migration he wanted in the first place.
It was the career equivalent of asking someone to be both the scapegoat and the savior. I won't be an employee under these terms, I said. If you want me back, the terms are clear. Employment with appropriate compensation, and a buyout or a partnership where Ironclad transitions its rights. Otherwise, transfer the IP. He didn't like the choice. He wanted to avoid it. But choices are the point of contracts. They force decisions that leadership often couches in management speak. This was naked decision-making. At 3:27 p.m., I received the first panicked external message from a vendor. Shipments delayed. Billing portal showing invalid payment token. I forwarded it to Richard with a 1-line note. This is an operational symptom of the breach. He called back in 20 minutes. We can wire, he said, but legal's worried about precedent. They want documentation and a holdback. Fine, I said. Hold back in escrow if you must, but the service is restored when funds clear and the assignment is executed. Submit proof of wire and send the draft for the assignment to Heavy Metal Dave. He will review for form. Negotiations are boring until they're not. They're a sequence of emails that read like a slow-motion hostage negotiation. Bank details, escrow instructions, red lines on assignment language, confirmation of beneficiary. Jared tried to argue value and principal in every other message, as if principal could pay a vendor whose invoices they ignored. Tyler kept sending messages with headers like positive spin and how to communicate, which is what people do when they want to hide panic in messaging. The clock moved like a clock does, steadily, unhelpful, indifferent. At 5:43 p.m., an operations manager sent a terse note. Payroll queue is stuck. It's affecting contractors. That sentence did more than convey a problem. It added a human face to an otherwise abstract business calculus. Contractors are people who often live close to the financial edge. Payroll delays cause real anxiety. I felt a small ripple of complicity in that, which is to say I didn't enjoy watching people get stressed. I enjoyed the enforcement because it was principled and fair in the context of a breached agreement, but enforcement sometimes forces collateral damage. It's a moral awkwardness I accepted because someone had to be the adult about stewardship of infrastructure. At 7:02 p.m., the CFO sent a terse confirmation. Wire pending, expect confirmation by COB with proof. I watched my inbox like a slow-burning fuse. Heavy Metal Dave and I traded quick texts. He was terse.
Get the wire proof. No unilateral changes. We'll draft the assignment in escrow. I slept a little that night, though not much. There is a particular exhaustion to waiting for money to move, because it turns human decisions into millisecond events inside banking rails you don't control. It is an odd place to feel both powerful and impotent. You own the rights, but you don't own the bank.
Early the next morning, I checked my email. Confirmation of wire receipt sat there like a small, cold trophy. The operations team sent a DM with a screenshot of the cleared transaction. I forwarded it to Heavy Metal Dave and told him to ready the assignment. He sent back a curt list of red lines and asked for a video call. On the video call, we negotiated language that was bureaucratic and meticulous in equal measure. Warranty disclaimers, assignment of support obligations, indemnities that read like grown-up apologies. Jared and Richard argued about the word ever had to draft a line that a lawyer actually approved before. They tried to recast the arrangement in terms that would make them look strategic and in control. I let them run their scripts while I ticked off items on the checklist I'd made 2 days ago. Wire, assignment, confirmation of administrative change. There is a strange satisfaction to crossing off such items. They are milestones in the careful reconstruction of leverage into outcomes. When the assignment was signed and the wire confirmed, I executed the transfer of a perpetual license and, as agreed, authorized the restoration of service. That authorization is a file of administrative steps that, to the outside, look like clicking a few checkboxes. Behind those steps are integrations and vendor tokens, and 1,000 tiny expectations that someone once had for reliability. The system hummed back into life in ways that are not cinematic, but are deeply technically beautiful. Rights began to go through, inventory started updating, vendor confirmations landed. I did not celebrate. I checked logs, confirmed the reconciliation of several stalled orders, and watched a payroll batch complete and hit its rails. The gratitude I felt was quiet and pride. It is not the sort of thing you put on a press release. It is the satisfaction of a design that does its work when called upon, the satisfaction of a contract holding weight, the satisfaction, finally, of visible labor. They wired the money. They paid the price. They regained their operations. Jared wrote a memo about leadership and rapid response that landed in everyone's inbox as if it were a spiritual exercise. Tyler prepared a town hall slide deck about migration timelines and moving fast. Richard sent me an email that tried hard to sound humble and corporate. Thank you. We appreciate your patience. I read the email and thought about coincidence and design. Had they learned anything? Would they remember the details beyond the settlement amount and the PR spin? My guess was as good as anyone's. Organizations forget unless taught to remember. I boxed up the license transfer paperwork, had Heavy Metal Dave send a final invoice for transfer fees, and wondered what the next phase would be. There are people in these stories who ask for revenge. There are people who demand narrative justice. I'm more interested in leverage and careers. I had options now that weren't available before. A tidy transfer, a bank confirmation, and the freedom to either rebuild somewhere else or stay on with negotiated terms. I chose neither of those immediately. I handed the ironclad keys to the company as per the assignment, and included a clause for a 90-day support window. In return, I received the agreed funds. The money did not fix everything about the way I felt about the industry, but it made clear what I'd been worth in a way a thank you never could. After the transfer, Jared tried to take credit publicly. He posted a message that lauded the team's resilience and used the event as proof that his directional choices had been right all along. The narrative device is ancient, scapegoat, then savior. He wanted both chapters in his memoir. But here's the thing about being the person who built the house. Even if someone else stands at the podium and claims the work, the original architect knows where the structural supports live. You can clap for the reprise of the old tune, but you remember who wrote the song. I packed my bag again, this time with less weight in my chest. I talked to Stan from Apex Logistics, who had reached out at some point during the outage. He had been a quiet watcher in the background and had asked for a coffee after the deal closed. There are new contracts that come with fresh starts, and sometimes that is better than staying to witness the same mistakes replayed. On the way out of the building, badge scanned, boxes carried, someone asked if I would consider coming back. It was a reasonable offer, power, title, a promise that culture would change. But promises are easy to make in corridors where no one must live with the consequences every day. No, I said, not like this. I left the elevator, and for a moment the city felt clean and full of spare air. The work had value, the pay had arrived, the story would be told incorrectly in some places and accurately in others. That last fact felt inevitable. I didn't know then what might happen next. The industry would keep turning. Jared would learn lessons or pretend to. Richard would recover his narrative equilibrium. I had an account at a new firm that wanted someone who actually understood these systems. Stan had been honest in a way I valued. There would be new code, new compromises, and perhaps fewer nights by the glow of a trucker's coffee. But these are later chapters. For now, there was a certain cold gratitude for contracts that mean things, and for the small, quiet legality that had turned dismissal into leverage. There was also a final private joke that lived in the margins of the contract. You can fire me as an employee, they had discovered, but you can't evict your landlord without paying rent.
If you like watching tech bros get their comeuppance, hit subscribe. It's the only door I'll voluntarily hold open for them.
You can imagine what the next week looked like from the outside. The company staged its usual recovery theater, statements about continuity and customer-first focus, and a town hall where Jared rebranded a crisis as a leadership opportunity. Internally, it was a patchwork of damage control, recriminations, and very quiet accountings. People who'd been invisible for years suddenly had receipts, and receipts are inconvenient for narratives that depend on forgetting. The first thing I did after the wire cleared and the assignment was signed was what I should have done years earlier. I took a very long inventory. Not of code, legally that belonged to them now, but of what I still had that no contract could sell: credibility, institutional knowledge, and a network of engineers who trusted me not to send them into an org dumpster fire without a parachute. I made a list of people I'd call if I wanted to build something that lasted longer than a quarterly earnings cycle. Mike was at the top. I called him before his 9 a.m. stand-up because I wanted him to hear it from me instead of Slack rumor mill. His voice was quiet but steadier than he sounded that Monday. There will be offers, I told him. Not all of them are good. He laughed in a way that betrayed relief. Are you hiring? He asked. I told him I hadn't decided yet, but he'd be the first to know. Stan from Apex Logistics texted 2 days after the incident, quiet, thoughtful messages that read like someone who had watched the outage from a safe distance, but had the kind of experience that respects competence when it shows up. He'd been watching the systems we'd built for years, and his note read like a proposition from someone who appreciates both talent and the consequences of broken supply chains. Coffee, it said. No fanfare, no ego. We met in a diner whose menu knew nothing about venture capital. The coffee was strong and appropriately mercenary. Stan listened while I told him what I would and what I wouldn't, that I had sold the license, that I wasn't taking the job to be a footnote in someone else's rebrand, that I wanted to build something resilient and worthy of the label enterprise grade. He nodded and asked the same questions: resource, runway, autonomy. For once, I didn't have to pretend I liked the word synergy. He offered an actual budget line and a clause in the contract that would have made most VCs faint: guaranteed engineering headcount, operational independence for 18 months, and no nonsensical move-fast mandates without a postmortem. It read like a promise someone intended to keep. A month later, I had a team, an office that smelled like new paint and possibility, and a clause in the new contract that was oddly satisfying: non-compete trimmed to reasonable bounds, and a strong IP clause acknowledging that what we would build now had to be ours. I had sold Quantum Ops. Legally, I could not recreate the same product verbatim. Ethically and practically, I had no interest in retyping someone else's work. What I had was experience, architectural patterns, hard-earned trade-offs, the mental model of a system that reconciled chaos into order. That model doesn't belong to a repo. It belongs to a person. News cycles are shallow but loud. Publicly, Richard thanked everyone for resilience, and Jared edited his LinkedIn to include a line about steering the company through transformational change. Internally, the board pulled a special session. I'm told later that a lot of board conversations sound like people reading paragraphs they wish were about other people. In practice, the fallout was less dramatic than the headlines promised, but more consequential in corridors. A reallocation of blame, a quiet shifting of roles, a memo about governance. Jared's title didn't vanish overnight. Organizations are slow-moving beasts, but he started spending time on projects with less direct operational impact. The new CTO narrative requires a new theater, and sometimes that theater is product incubation, far from the parts that actually keep customers fed. Whether he saw it as demotion or escape was his business. Tyler wrote a lot of communications that summer. He learned how to make slide decks feel like pep rallies and how to put alignment in every header. He remained optimistic in the way some people remain religious. They believe the ritual will alter reality. Brenda took a leave for a bit. HR is a weird place where people absorb blame and paperwork in equal measure, and she needed space. Mike joined me at Apex 3 months later. He'd watched the outage turn into negotiation and decided he preferred the engineering work that actually moved shipments to the calm ambiguity of corporate messaging. I thought a lot about how narratives get reshaped. Jared wanted to be the savior in public, and the myth of momentum was useful to him. Richard wanted to close the chapter without acknowledging the underlying problem. But narratives are fragile things. The customers who'd been inconvenienced filed claims for service credits. The insurance folks who cover operational disruption began asking more pointed questions. Clients with procurement teams, people who had a day job for which a stalled PO is as catastrophic as a hospital missing medicine, started to ask for post-incident reviews. Those reviews, detailed and incumbent on facts,
are the things that dig into the weeds and tend to come back to what engineers call root cause. Root cause for that outage was, bluntly, failure to respect contractual obligations and a leadership decision to treat a vendor relationship as if it were arbitrary. I don't take pleasure in watching people squirm. I take satisfaction in predictable outcomes following reasonable actions. You cannot simultaneously refuse to pay for a thing and expect to keep using it without consequence. I stood by a framework that had the uncomfortable advantage of being true.
People asked me, more than a few times, whether I regretted the way I had enforced the contract. It's an ethical question that deserves a serious answer. If someone willfully ignores a formal obligation, and that obligation keeps entire processes running for people who will be harmed by its failure, then enforcing the instrument is the responsible thing to do. It's ledger hygiene. I accept that the enforcement caused short-term pain. I accept the moral unease. I do not accept the erasure of the long-term value I created by being labeled legacy and then discarded. There's a difference between being punitive and being accountable. I aimed for the latter. A month after I'd settled into the new role at Apex, Stanford Logistics announced a partnership with the very company that had once paid my invoices late. Their press release praised collaborative resilience and included a quote from Jared about forward-thinking partnerships. It read like a sugarcoating of financial stress. The stock dipped that afternoon the same way certain pressure gauges drop when a system loses steam. Traders like loud narratives. They hate uninsured risks. Market consequences arrived not as a moral judgment, but as cash-scented efficiency. Investors prefer companies that can prove they can manage operations without surprises. There were other, quieter consequences. A few of my former peers left the company in the months that followed. Some had been waiting for a moment to leave. The outage lit a match. Others were pushed by the shifting culture. One of them, an old friend named Priya, emailed me to say she was starting a nonprofit that would teach engineers how to negotiate contracts. I snorted coffee onto the page. Good cover for launching a morally upright roadshow, but I was not unsympathetic. Knowledge about IP, licensing, and negotiation is not glamorous. It is survival. Heavy Metal Dave, predictably, had opinions. He drafted the assignment and then billed me for his time in a way that reflected both legal acumen and his approximate hourly rates for caffeine-fueled contracts. He came by the Apex office one midday with a battered acoustic guitar. He insists he's not a stereotype. And a bill that made me smile because it meant expense checks and sanity were returning in equal measure. "You bought leverage," he said, thumbing the invoice like it was a small novel. "That is sometimes worth more than a medal." We had one more conversation after the funds cleared and the assignment was final. He asked the question lawyers like to ask when nobody else does. What's the precedent you want to leave? I thought about it. Lawyers like precedent because it makes future arguments easier. I don't live by precedents, I live by consequence. That people who build things have options, I said, and that contracts mean something. He looked at me like he half expected an epiphany and half expected a punchline. "That's reasonable," he said. "Also, get a will for the LLC.
Don't die on a clause." There is an unglamorous sequence to establishing a new product that takes space away from the mythical overnight success. We wrote requirements, hired people, argued about whether to adopt microservices or a slightly less fashionable monolith for the first iteration. We debated trade-offs I had once had to make alone at 3 a.m. The new system we built, call it for now Apex Fulfillment Engine, was designed under a different set of constraints. We had a budget that would cover decent chairs, a product lead who understood vendor negotiations, and an executive who was uninterested in optics that compromised operations. Our first version was lean and boring and reliable. It was the kind of system that gave you fewer talking points in quarterly presentations, but more confidence when you wake up and servers are humming. We launched the system 6 months after the sale. The rollout was intentionally incremental. We invited a handful of vendors, watched traffic patterns, ran reconciliation tests at scale. It was gloriously unsexy. The first time 100,000 SKUs reconciled correctly and invoices closed without human intervention, we had a small party in the office with cheap pizza and a playlist only engineers could love. Mike toasted with a paper cup and said dryly, "To not being the subject of Jared's case study." The media, predictably, looked for a hero. I declined interviews that sought to dramatize the sale into a David and Goliath fairy tale. There is a difference between being a protagonist in a narrative that others will reduce to sound bites and being a person whose work makes operational reliability possible. I wanted the latter. The headlines, though, were merciless in their appetite for moral clarity. CTO fired her, took credit. She held the rights. One tech blog ran. The phrasing was flattering in a way I didn't expect. It made for good traffic. Jared eventually left the company. By that point, it was a slow and polite departure rather than a sudden ejection. His next LinkedIn update announced he was exploring new opportunities in platform innovation. People interpreted that line with the requisite amount of pity or optimism according to their investment thesis. He ended up at a startup that promised disruption without bureaucracy. I do not know if he is happier. People who chase disruption sometimes find they enjoy being hungry more than being fed. Richard, to his credit, tried to publicly close the loop by commissioning a formal post-incident review and promising governance reforms.
Whether those reforms took root is not the point of this story. Organizations either institutionalize learning or they perform it. Both are plausible outcomes, and both happen in the same building with equal frequency. Apex grew. We closed several enterprise clients who wanted reliability more than catchy product narratives.
I hired people I respected, gave them autonomy, and insisted that they be paid for the invisible work that keeps systems intact. We built support budgets that recognized that being core deserved more than lip service. It felt like running a small utopia, imperfect and provisional, but principled enough to survive a board meeting. There were pressures. Investors wanted growth, and growth creates incentives that can push engineers into shortcuts. We resisted the most tempting ones: morning stand-ups that were really mandate sessions, quarterly OKRs that ignored long-term debt. We were boring. It was part of the plan. A year later, I sat at a conference with Mike, now leading the platform team, and Stan in the front row. A moderator asked me, with curiosity that smelled faintly of schadenfreude, what advice I had for engineers who were considering protecting their work by forming an LLC or threading IP into a licensing arrangement. I gave the sort of answer that lawyers would appreciate and founders would find reasonable. Know your rights, document your work, and don't be naive about the motivations of the people you serve. That is not glamorous advice. It is, however, useful. People sometimes confuse ownership with authorship. Ownership is what contracts arrange: who has title, who collects payment, who bears liability. Authorship is what you carry in your head: decisions about idempotency, about how to normalize inconsistent vendor data, about the edge cases that will eventually break every naive design. Authorship is harder to prove but easier to feel. There are no plaques for it, only the occasional quiet email from a vendor who says, "This used to be a mess until you showed up." Those emails are currency in a different economy. There are small, satisfying cruelties left in the world of corporate life. Jared tried for a moment to claim the revival as a strategic pivot of his own making. He had a memo about leadership and resilience distributed company-wide. He spoke at a conference about championing change. A recruiter later forwarded me that memo with a note. "Is this the Jared we know?" I laughed, and then I copied a relevant line and told him to keep it in his files. We both knew how narratives get polished. I spent some money on practical things with the proceeds: new ergonomic chairs for my team, a modest emergency fund for contractors, a legal retainer so I would never again be surprised by petty contract minutia. I didn't buy a yacht. I bought safety and dignity, things that don't photograph well but that keep you from taking brutal calls at 2 a.m. Because the next time someone tries to label your work legacy garbage, you have two options: accept it, or make sure your rights are written so they carry weight. People asked whether I would ever go back to that company. The short answer is no. The longer answer is complex. There are relationships and colleagues I valued, but the cultural choices that lead to an enforcement scenario like that are baked into systems. Changing them requires leadership that will persist longer than a single quarter. I'm not a believer in dramatics for the sake of theatrical closure. I believed in the job I had now, which was to build something better, and in paying the people who make it run. Once in a while, someone will show up at my office for advice, an engineer who has written something useful and is told it should just be thrown into the repo. They ask whether it's worth the work to incorporate or to insist on an assignment. I tell them the same thing I told Mike in the earliest days. Protect your work, but don't live in a fortress. Contracts are instruments, not talismans. They have to be paired with relationships and transparency. If you want to be invisible to the people who profit from your labor, you will be invisible when trouble arrives. If you insist on recognition and compensation, you must be precise and willing to enforce the paper when necessary. When I think back to that day in the glass room, I remember two things most clearly: the thinness of Jared's triumph and the weight of a contract that had been shaped not from spite but from survival. People like to tell stories where the protagonist slays the dragon with righteous fury. My story is less cinematic. I didn't break anything. I exercised rights that existed in black and white, points on paper articulated when we were not thinking about headlines but about continuity. That kind of enforcement is tedious and precise. It is not a moral carnival. It is discipline. There is one scene I carry with me: me handing over the license transfer paperwork at the closing table, a pen that felt heavier than it had any right to be, and Heavy Metal Dave looking at me with something like approval. He has an odd way of measuring justice. If it can be invoiced and it keeps someone out of court, he calls it civilized. I tend to agree. People will tell you different lessons from this. Investors will say it shows the value of governance. Startups will say it proves that legacy systems are liabilities. Engineers will tell you it's evidence that you should always copy your contracts and keep receipts of your sacrifices. Those are all true in small ways. The lesson I carry is less prescriptive and more personal. If you build something that others depend on, make sure the terms of that dependence are explicit. The next time someone wants to label your work garbage, the paperwork will not care about rhetoric. Paperwork only cares about signatures, dates, and defined remedies.
The money helped. The sale clarified what my labor was worth in a single sharp figure. It didn't heal the nights I'd spent on calls, or the missed birthdays, or the little ways my life had bent to keep other people's operations functional.
But it did enforce an ugly truth in the nicest possible way. When value is invisible, it's worth converting it into something that can be negotiated. I left the company with no desire to be named in the press release. I wanted a place where people would be paid for the grunt and poetry that is engineering. I wanted to build, and to teach that building has a cost worth honoring. If there's a single blunt takeaway, it's this: you can fire someone, you can take credit, and you can make a great show of leadership. But if you've been careless enough to ignore the rent on the house you thought you owned, your victory may be a very expensive one. Contracts don't care about posturing. They only care about clauses. He fired me, and for a while he tried to stand in the light. He took the applause and the bylines. What he forgot was what the ink on the contract said about ownership. He forgot I held the rights. If you want the blow-by-blow on the license toggle, or the prequel about the 2020 nights that made quantum ops necessary, say the word and I'll tell you the rest.